Since we're in a university, we're doing this very uncharacteristically un-Armenian and starting on time. Please have your seats. I'm Aram Arkun. I'm managing editor of the Armenian Mirror-Spectator, the oldest ongoing English language Armenian newspaper in the world, as far as I know. Thank you. Before I start, I'd like to just express my gratitude to Tufts University Professor of Mathematics, Bruce Bohosian, for his help in reserving this hall tonight. Bruce was reappointed as president of the American University of Armenia a few months ago, so he's unable to be present right now. But I hope he'll view the video and hear that we appreciate his assistance in this. I also have to warn you something which is very unusual about this room. I was told that this room has small microphones embedded throughout the ceiling. That means that anything you say is going to be picked up by our audio system, and we're also recording this for posterity, so I would ask you kindly to do two things: to turn off your cell phones, and secondly, not to talk except officially when we have Q&A session, which we will have. So just a friendly warning. So anyhow, the Mirror-Spectator is commemorating its 90th anniversary this weekend, and we're starting tonight with a panel of distinguished journalists. And tomorrow we have a banquet with Sonam Movsesian of the Conan O'Brien Show as MC, and many more prominent guests at the Burlington Marriott. And I have to say that, well, we're very close to being sold out. We still have some limited number of tickets available. If any of you are still interested in going, afterwards you can come and see me, or you can do it online too, but it's probably better, and we can see if we can help you, or if you have friends who want to go. It's going to be a very nice evening. We have a few other special surprise guests. So, and one last bit of promotion. If you don't already subscribe to the Mirror-Spectator, please consider going to mirrorspectator.com and subscribing to our print edition, or if you prefer donating. But, you know, we're a non-profit, and newspaper business is something that relies on the support of our community and guests. So anyhow, I will introduce each panelist prior to his or her talk. After all four speak, they may decide to comment or ask each other questions, and then that will be followed by a Q&A session, which will be open to all of you. And we have a second mic, which I'll bring to you for comments. And we will also have refreshments at the end of the formal event. So I'd like to begin now with our first speaker. Charles Mahtesian is, first of all, I'm proud to say, a fellow Sepastasi, like me, most importantly, as well as a graduate of the Armenian Sisters Academy in Radnor, Pennsylvania, so a graduate of Armenian School. In addition, secondarily, he's also Politico senior politics editor. He returned to Politico in 2015 after spending 2 years at NPR, where he served as politics editor and deputy Washington desk chief. And prior to that, he spent 5 years directing Politico's political coverage. He's served as editor-in-chief of the National Journal's Almanac of American Politics, often referred to as the Bible of American Politics, and worked in many other places. But again, very importantly, in 2012, he received the Armenian Mirror-Spectator's Award of Excellence. So we're very happy to welcome him back tonight to our program, Charlie Mahtesian. Please. I suggest up to the...
Thank you for the warm introduction, Adam. It's great to see you again, and it's wonderful to be here with such a distinguished panel, and also to have a nice turnout on a Friday night of people here to listen about a really important issue, I think. And, you know, Adam mentioned I went to school at Armenian Sisters Academy, and when I hear from my schoolmates from way back when, or from people at the church I attended when I was a kid, it's almost always the same thing. My experience is that they write me, I don't see them that much anymore, and it's mainly to make one point. Where the hell are you? Where is the media? Where is the coverage? We're in crisis, and the world has forgotten us. No one's writing about it. Where is your news organization? Where is our local paper? And so the question is always, why won't the media focus on the injustices, the hardships, the aggression? And so I'm hoping to talk a little bit about that, and happy to answer questions. Also to maybe illuminate a little, to answer some of these questions that I think so many people have. And hopefully I can provide some context. And I think that conversation begins with talking about the news industry and the circumstances we're under, because that underpins everything. When you wonder, why isn't this in this news outlet? Where's the coverage? Our economics are in flux. I mean, Ken can tell you, we're struggling. A lot of news organizations are struggling. Some of us are doing well, but most of them aren't. Newspapers are dying every day. Newspapers are going out of business every day. Most are a shell of the way they used to be. And nowhere is that clearer than on the foreign bureaus of most news organizations. It's not the way it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, certainly not a half century ago. There just aren't bodies on these desks. Publications, news outlets do not have resources anymore. They're all stretched incredibly thin. And so that's really a long way of saying that there just aren't that many news outlets and reporters covering foreign affairs anymore. And those that do are stretched really thin. And the next factor there is, it's always important to keep in mind that we are, as we all in this room know, we're dealing with a complicated situation in a complicated part of the world, and there's not a great deal of familiarity. I've found in my experience there's not even a great amount of familiarity among those people who are in the business of writing about foreign affairs. They have not spent their careers focusing on the Caucasus. They have not spent their careers getting familiar with that region at all. In many ways, it's the last region they've ever thought about. They've spent their careers covering Europe. They've spent their careers covering the Middle Eastern conflict. They've spent their careers in Asia. None of them has a great deep dive familiarity with Armenia and Artsakh and all those kinds of issues. And so there's just not a lot of familiarity among the reporters, or even in the editing offices, in the editing suites, where oftentimes the story decisions are getting made, where people are talking about, what do we need to have on our front page? What do we need to cover? No familiarity there either. And obviously that's a real problem for us. And but Armenia is not the only place that's affected by this. And you see this, if you put it in, sort of pull out the lens, you begin to see that there are other places where familiarity is not necessarily deep, or the resource problem begins to show itself. And here we're talking about, rising tensions in Northern Ireland, the powder keg of Kosovo, what's happening in Niger. There's all sorts of conflicts across the world, and we are shrinking and have less resources than ever. And that, obviously, in my mind, has come to a head in the last year, at least, when it comes to coverage of Armenia, and it's been tremendously frustrating for all of us. And it's been frustrating for those of us in the media, too. It is a hard pill to swallow, to hear from your friends, the people you care about, and they're frustrated with you. And that's tough. And the other thing I think is important is to understand the distinction between media outlets. And that's an important thing, I think, for Armenian Americans to understand who actually could cover this. I mean, we're all different. You may not see it, but we're all different in different ways. We have different audiences, different markets we're dealing with. And the best way that Armenians can be good advocates for stories and for the kind of coverage that we think is fair and that we think illuminates a terrible situation is to familiarize ourselves with the outlets, understand who might write about it, understand who their audience is, what is the story that they will buy, what is the story they'll bite on, how can I place an op-ed there. I think we have, as a community, done fairly well at that, but not as well as maybe, not as well as you'd want to. So I think it's important for the Armenian American community to have a better grasp of the media ecosystem, understand who is interested in this story and how do we focus their lens on the story. And I guess lastly, I think it's, last point I want to make is is when you study these publications and their audiences, think about what they write about generally and how they tell their stories. And here I'm talking about not just your local paper, not just the Globe. Like, you want to think about, say you're wondering, even your local paper, why doesn't my local paper write about this? This is a big story. Now, if it's the Boston Globe or the LA Times, they sort of have to write about it. There are big Armenian communities there. It's an easy call for them. Elsewhere, it's not so easy. Most people aren't familiar. They have no idea about Armenia, no idea at all. And we, I think, as a community, need to educate them. And that's okay. They want to know. Let them know how big the community is there, how this story matters to them. And the only way they're going to write about it is if they get familiar with it. And that starts with not angry emails to those journalists who are covering it, if they occasionally cover it. It's establishing a relationship, because they're not going to write about it that much. So maybe they write about it, you didn't love that story. Maybe you just write a note, I read your story, I enjoyed it, I learned a lot, I think you could have had this, or you maintain a relationship. The point being, you don't always want to be, if you're trying to reach journalists and persuade journalists to cover the kinds of things that we think are important, you don't want to reach out once in your life with an angry email questioning their integrity. You know, the best way to be effective really is to establish a relationship. This is what the best politicians do. All the best politicians do that. They have an ongoing conversation, you know, sort of a under the table conversation all the time, so that they're not just going to the media in times of need or when they need something. There's an ongoing relationship. They understand each other, and it facilitates a level of a deeper kind of relationship. And so I found that in my own case, it's been, for me, and I'm very interested in hearing some other experiences with this, it's been a source of huge frustration for me over the course of my career, the lack of coverage, especially in recent years, of Armenia and Artsakh and a whole bunch of other things. And it's hard because I understand that my news organization, which has now gone global, it didn't used to be, it used to be all domestic, has other priorities. I understand how it works. I understand what it looks like under the hood, why we make our decisions, and understand the sort of the vagaries of the editorial process. But nevertheless, it's frustrating to sort of be constrained from seeing that story written. And what I found was incredibly effective was I had never written about, I do domestic politics. That's all I do. You know, I'm the sports section. I think, you know, campaigns, elections, presidential campaigns, things like that. And so we rarely covered whether it was the genocide resolution in Congress, even as we expanded and built out a European publication, didn't write much about Armenia. That wasn't talked about much in Brussels until recently. But the odd thing was, when Joe Biden signed the genocide resolution, I can remember being in an editorial meeting and being so frustrated because I was explaining to people why this mattered, because again, no one understood anything, and not because they weren't paying attention or weren't smart. It's not on their radar. They don't know. And so I tried to explain to them, this is a great story, not just because I'm telling you this as an Armenian, but it's just a great storytelling opportunity. It is an important moment in politics, and here's why. And I got a chance to write it, but they wanted me to write it from a personal perspective. And so you can find this online. It was, what was the headline? We did a very straightforward, basic headline. Why the Armenian genocide resolution is a big deal. Like, that was the way to sell it to an audience that had no idea. And so I was asked to write it and explain it the way I did in this editorial meeting, which was in a very personal way. I explained the politics of it as the politics editor, saying, you know, here are all the forces that have conspired against this over the years, the K Street lobby that is pouring in $1 gazillion against Armenian interests, and politicians that have been persuaded by that. And here's the great politics. There's a great story to be told here. And the backstory is, this is what happened to my family. So they're like, can you write that all up? So I wrote it. And the amazing thing is, I think it was probably the biggest story I'll ever write in my career in terms of traffic-wise. It gained so many views that they did a podcast on it, and I couldn't believe it. And the one lesson I took away from that is, you know, for Armenian journalists, like, the best way to get that story out there sometimes is to tell stories the best kind of story, which is always a sort of personal human story instead of that sort of dry, bloodless policy thing. And then I'm sorry for filibustering. I'll just make one last point that I think is super important here, and that is, what do you do about it? What can we do about it in the audience? We're limited as journalists because we can't be advocates for stories because we lose our credibility within our own offices, and it's not what we do. But there are some things I think that as a whole, as a community, we can do, and one of them is, I think, and I'm already seeing this, and it's really a hopeful sign. It is dominating social media. I think that is so important for us. I think for Armenians, it is essential that we dominate that space. I mean, it's no exaggeration to say it's a David and Goliath battle. It is. It really is. At least in the political world that I live in, what I see, it is a David-Goliath battle, and we know in a global context it is too. And the best way to fight that when you're a smaller community is social media now. It is the great equalizer. And so I think we saw the power of it in recent months. I think, and I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, people who have watched closely, I think that the Armenian community dominated. I think it won the narrative. I think that it was all over social media with videos and storytelling and convinced and was able to affect global policymakers and also the media. Because keep in mind, like, if you're thinking about Twitter, much of Twitter's audience is decision makers, it's the media. And when you dominate that space, you're getting that story in front of all of them. And I felt Armenians were incredibly effective there. Here I'm talking about diaspora Armenians. And I thought that was just an amazing moment, because flooding social media to tell the story of what was really happening and really effective. And I think ultimately, when you think of the media in this context of this discussion tonight, that is an area that is going to be incredibly important as we go forward. So thanks.
Thank you very much. That was a great start. Dr. Carla Garapedian might be known to many of you among Armenians for her documentary film Screamers, which was about denial of the Armenian genocide and focusing on System of a Down. Based in Los Angeles and London, she's a documentary filmmaker, but she's also been a producer for ITN's The World This Week, a correspondent for NBC News and NBC Sunrise from the London Bureau, as well as a CNBC anchor from London. She was producer/director for the UK's Channel 4's investigative series Dispatches, and a producer-director for BBC Assignment, the BBC's foreign documentary series. And currently she's working on a very interesting project. She's in pre-production for Nemesis 1921, which is a film about the shooting of Talat Pasha in Berlin by Solomon Tehlirian. So she's done many other very helpful things for the Armenian community through the Armenian Film Foundation. And so it's a pleasure to welcome Carla to the podium.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, all of you who've come tonight to this event. It's such a wonderful opportunity also to celebrate the Mirror-Spectator's 90th anniversary. I'm so proud to be a part of this, and I look forward to opening that newspaper every week. Whatever's going on in the world, I know I can open up that newspaper, and something in there will be uplifting. My first encounter with how the American media covers Armenian issues was when I was 14 years old. And I'm giving away my age here. It was 1975. The 60th commemoration of the Armenian genocide. And in Los Angeles, our local PBS channel, KCET, agreed to broadcast a documentary made by J. Michael Hacopian called The Forgotten Genocide. And it featured academics and survivors. Now, Hacopian had been commissioned by the Armenian community in LA to make the film, and getting it accepted onto public television, well, that was something of a coup. But it was too easy. The week of the broadcast, I took a call from my father at our home in North Hollywood. It was a representative of the U.S. State Department. This gentleman said he was calling to say the State Department believed the documentary should not air because it could, quote, damage U.S.-Turkish relations, unquote. Now, years later, I wondered if I had really heard those words correctly. Did the official really say it so baldly? A TV show should be pulled because of U.S. foreign policy issues? Well, my father was a journalism professor, and he had a former student in the office of Mayor Tom Bradley. And upon hearing about this appeal from the federal government, Bradley intervened, told the State Department to mind its own business, and the documentary aired. Now, I was confused about why my own country would behave this way. I mean, it was my first experience seeing Armenians, how Americans viewed Armenians, not as the kings and queens with a great and noble history, but instead a small, insignificant minnow in a large pool of sharks. But moreover, it showed the power of media and how that power was perceived by our leaders. Fast forward, London, 1988. I was a fledgling producer on a weekly international politics news show, Channel 4 TV in London. A cataclysmic earthquake hit Armenia, and I was charged to find someone to get on live TV quick. At that time, Armenia was a faraway Soviet satellite, closed to the Western world, and because of that, not often covered by Western media. This was not yet Artsakh, the subject of our panel today, but allow me to make a parallel. Now, my colleague at NBC's London Bureau, Charles Sabine, he was also scrambling at that time. How could NBC cover that story? We couldn't get there, he said. We didn't know how to get there. Actually, I emailed him last week to ask him if he could remember exactly what happened, and he sent me an email today. He said he actually joined a BBC crew with a great Kate 80, and together they flew to Turkey and then drove to Armenia. Don't ask me how exactly they got there, what the route was, but he told me it was not an easy journey. And years later, he still characterizes it as an exotic road trip of sorts. And that about summarizes how the place, the people were seen back then. Some faraway, exotic place within the Russian orbit. Something of an anomaly to cover. As for me, I did manage to get an eyewitness to the earthquake for my show. Her name was Annie King Underwood. She was in Armenia, and she was there when the earthquake happened. Now, I didn't tell my boss she was actually Armenian, because when he heard her name, King Underwood, he thought, oh, good, nice British girl. In any case, Annie gave a harrowing report of what was happening on the ground. Now, we didn't have a government official, we didn't have a representative of any NGO, just one eyewitness. Without her, I doubt we would have covered the story at all. It was a remote place in the Soviet Union. But even then, we knew something was happening that was more than an earthquake, then in 1988. Not long after that, Armenia would clamor for independence. The earthquake was the start of the great dissolution of the Soviet Empire. So, fast forward again to 2005. The commissioning editor of one of the BBC's most prestigious documentary series, it's called Storyville, they ran into an Armenian filmmaker in Prague. This filmmaker, named Vardan Hovhannisyan, he had exclusive footage of veteran soldiers from Artsakh's first war. It was more than a decade after they had fought, but their perspective was interesting. And the BBC, the editor thought, well, this could make an interesting documentary. So the BBC funded that feature-length documentary, which came to be called A Story of People in War and Peace. The film went on to win all sorts of prizes all over the world, and it raised awareness about Artsakh and the reasons why so many risked their lives to fight for it. Now, this same BBC commissioning editor, who was not Armenian, also commissioned Screamers, my documentary about the Armenian genocide. So that was 2 documentaries about Armenians in the same year. The result was, not surprisingly, the BBC got a torrent of complaints from, guess who, the British Turkish community. Why was the BBC so pro-Armenian? I was asked to answer some of the email complaints. Why wasn't I telling the Turk side of the genocide? Well, I said, there aren't two sides to genocide. It happened. Should we get the Nazi point of view of the Holocaust? My superiors weren't too happy with my response, but there it was. Now, many Armenians today think the BBC's coverage of the 2020 war in Artsakh and the 2023 blockade was pro-Azeri, mainly because of moral equivalence and what I would call both-sidism, treating both sides equally. That was prevalent in the coverage. And the tendency was to frame it as Azerbaijan, quote, taking back control, unquote, from the, quote, breakaway region. I don't think the BBC was alone in this. By the way, Nagorno-Karabakh, true, was never recognized by the international community. But to call it a breakaway republic takes us back to the late 80s, not 2023. And the idea of restoring the territorial integrity, or sovereignty of Azerbaijan, well, that was a way of framing the issue. It was as if the people of Artsakh never had the right of self-determination in the first place. True, this appeared to be a frozen conflict for decades, but it never really was a frozen conflict. It was just contained. The tendency to minimize the scale of the conflict was also prevalent in media coverage. Politico, excuse me, Charles, represented it as, or at least the blockade, as weeks of bloody clashes. But the reality was it was a 9-month blockade. And it wasn't just Politico. I mean, others represented it that way. And a 9-month blockade is the attempt to wear down the will of an entire people. The International Court of Justice ruled that the blockade produced a real and imminent risk to the health and life of Nagorno-Karabakh's Armenian population. And Luis Moreno Ocampo, the first chief prosecutor of the ICJ, he called it a genocide. But that word certainly was not to be found in the international media, not surprisingly. Armenians today wonder why Artsakh didn't get the kind of saturation coverage we're seeing now in the Middle East. Why? Well, the stakes were perceived to be so minor that the mobilization of resources by media organizations was simply not there. You just heard that from Charles. It's partly about the resources you have to mobilize. And if the stakes are not seen to be high, why would you mobilize those scarce resources? European coverage, I will say, was much better than American coverage for that reason. It felt closer. It felt European. The stakes were perceived to be higher. But to Americans, it was another faraway place, not really relevant to Americans. And the role of Azeri disinformation can't be minimized here. That's the subject of another panel, but it played a key influence on what people read and heard on social media around the world. Now, I've recently heard some commentators, mainly in the Armenian community, use the word indigenous. Indigenous. What do we mean by that? Armenians, well, they don't really like to use that word. But in reference to Artsakh Armenians, we're increasingly hearing it. Maybe if the word indigenous had been used to describe the Artsakh Armenians from the get-go, maybe that would have helped. Armenians don't like to say that they are indigenous or to use the indigenous word, especially American Armenians, because to be considered Asiatic or Near Eastern really wasn't desirable to Armenians who came here to America in the 19th century and early 20th century. My great-grandfather was Tatos Kvartosian, the chief plaintiff in a very well-known case in America, which determined whether or not an Armenian could be called Asiatic or African. Ever since then, Armenians have been considered white Europeans, and that helped them to fight discrimination in the United States. Well, that history aside, if we called the Artsakh people indigenous, that would frame the conflict differently. Now, Mashinka Ferenc Hacopian puts it like this: bombarded by cluster munitions, suicide drone strikes, and untold human rights violations, Artsakh's people defend their right to live and govern themselves on ancestral lands, populated by Armenians since antiquity. Indigenous people fighting for their rights. It has a different ring, doesn't it? I'll end with the BBC's interview of Ruben Vardanyan. Ruben, as many of us know, is a businessman and a philanthropist dedicated to Artsakh. He moved there. He gave up his Russian citizenship and he moved there. He was interviewed by Stephen Sacker of the BBC's Hard Talk, which is one of the BBC's top interview shows. And yes, there was indeed a lot of hard talk in that interview. Towards the end of the interview, Stephen Sacker put the situation as he saw it to Ruben. Don't you think, he said, without an agreement with Azerbaijan and any global support, the Armenians have no choice but to leave Nagorno-Karabakh? No, Ruben said. We should not be forced to leave. We won't leave. That's not the question, said Stephen Sacker. Realistically, you'll have to if you don't have an agreement. It was as if Ruben was being forced to accept the inevitable erasure of Armenians. The only way to avoid annihilation was to capitulate. Now, that question became the source of a complaint by the Armenian community in Britain to the BBC. They thought Stephen Sacker wasn't being fair to Ruben Vardanyan. But wasn't Stephen Sacker making a simple statement of fact? Perhaps. But the question to Ruben Vardanyan could have just as easily been, what can you do to get more global support to prevent ethnic cleansing? Or why is the international community turning its back on ethnic cleansing? These questions could have been asked, but weren't, because that wasn't the framing. Ruben was the leader of a breakaway republic, after all, and that's just what happens when you lose a war you shouldn't have started in the first place, right? That's how it was framed. And now Anthony Blinken has said Armenia's territorial borders must be respected. I wonder what will happen if they're not. Recalling the U.S. State Department representative who called my house in 1975, who said a documentary about the Armenian genocide could damage U.S.-Turkish relations. Well, it's now almost 50 years later. Has that calculus changed? I wonder.
Thank you for that excellent talk, Carla. Ken Dilanian is the Justice and Intelligence correspondent for NBC News, based in Washington, D.C. He spent much of his early career at the Philadelphia Inquirer as a suburban reporter, but was eventually sent to its Rome bureau, from which he frequently went to Iraq in order to cover the Iraq War. He worked for 3 years at USA Today, where he covered foreign policy and Congress, and was a reporter in the Los Angeles Times Washington bureau as well from 2010 to 2014, before starting his current job at NBC. And I can't help but add that Ken is the proud grandson of an Armenian legionnaire who served with the French after the Armenian genocide. I'm very happy to have Ken join our panel and give his insights on these topics.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for inviting me. It's such an honor to be here with these esteemed panelists, and thank you all for coming out on a balmy autumn Friday night. It's interesting. This may be the first time I've ever addressed a group of Armenians, so this is a treat for me. I'm kind of different from, I would say, these other three folks in that I'm half Armenian on my father's side. As Aaron said, I'm very proud of my heritage. My grandfather, who fought in the Legion and came over to the United States to raise a family in Jamaica Plain, raised 3 children, sort of vaulted them into the middle class of America. But my dad grew up, and my sister Jane is over there, so we're the two of us. But my dad grew up in the 30s and 40s in the time of assimilation, right? And so he barely spoke Armenian, although his father never spoke English. And so I certainly didn't grow up. That was an adventure. He was alive during my childhood, so I remember him, a tough man. My grandmother was more refined, spoke 5 languages, spoke English perfectly, grew up in Istanbul, I think. But so I'm probably, consider me a lapsed Armenian, not a great Armenian. I mean, I don't speak the language. I'm not a member of the church. And so I've never really, I don't identify as much as an Armenian American any more than I do a German American, which is on my mother's side. So it's been an interesting exercise thinking about why the media, and as Charlie said, we're all so different. The media is a misnomer, right? But like, why my network, a national network, NBC, and of course, full disclosure, I'm not speaking for NBC here, but why we aren't covering this really significant, particularly lately, and tragic and important story. And the reality is, and Charlie got at this a bit, I was thinking about this, even if there wasn't a Russian invasion of Ukraine and a war in the Middle East and a former president facing 4 criminal indictments who's running for president again, even if those things didn't exist, I'm not sure that this story would have broken through. I think the displacement would have, and in fact, I didn't even realize this, but NBC News actually did cover that for one day. They did one story. One of my colleagues in the London Bureau, Matt Bradley, did a package. It ran on our streaming service, which is called NBC News Now. It didn't run on the network or nightly news. They wrote an article, which was on our website. And I was talking to Matt today, actually, and some other folks, and just so you understand, I cover the Justice Department. I'm in Washington. I'm not making any decisions about, whether we cover Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh or Armenia. I'm completely out of that. But I was talking to some of the people who do make those decisions, and they were saying they certainly were thinking about it and talking about it in our London bureau, where the international coverage decisions are made. But it just wasn't the kind of thing that they thought they could sell to the shows that have the money to pay for crews to go out, because TV is expensive. Particularly when you go to a war zone, you need security. As an old print reporter, I could travel light. It's just me and a notebook, maybe a photographer. TV it's a big endeavor when you're producing network news. So that it just wasn't. It's almost. They didn't even try, actually, to sell the story to the Today Show or Nightly News, because they knew it wasn't going to break through. I can understand that. I mean, there are, as Charlie was saying, there are a lot of awful things happening in the world and global crises that aren't covered. I mean, there's a genocide happening in Sudan. You mentioned Kosovo. Let's face it, I mean, Americans, it would be a cliche to say Americans can't find Armenia on a map. Americans probably can't find Ireland on a map. Most Americans, right? We're not great at geography, but there is something to that. I mean, we're all in a business where we're trying to grab audience, grab eyeballs, and I know a lot of people think, well, if you guys covered it, then maybe more people would be interested in it, and so but actually, NBC pays people a lot of money to figure out what the audience wants. And I can guarantee you, if the audience wanted this story, they would be getting it. And they're just not getting that that demand signal. And that's it's too bad for us, those of us who care about this. And I also think, the contrast with Israel is interesting, right? And there's a lot of reasons why all the major media is leaning into this. But I think one of the biggest reasons, and it's the same reason we're covering Ukraine, is that American strategic interests are implicated in a major way. And that's really what drives foreign news, particularly for networks, is, because look, I mean, there are American troops that are on the ground in Israel. There are other, that we just had a strike against Iranian forces, which you could argue is related to this whole thing. That just isn't the case in the Artsakh situation, for better or worse. And I'm getting a little out of my depth in terms of the geopolitics, but I wonder how much the fact that that the Russians are involved and the long Armenian alliance with Russia has influenced how the American news media looks at this issue. I know I talked to one of my colleagues who covers the State Department today, and she said that this issue gets asked. This comes up at every briefing. They have a daily State Department briefing, and somebody asks a question about this. So the American government is being questioned about it by journalists. You're just not hearing much about it. And American diplomats have been involved, but it does seem like their hands are tied, or they feel like their hands are tied. And many of you probably wonder, why is that? It has a lot to do with the unforgiving nature of geopolitics. And in terms of the news media, I mean, the news cycle is unforgiving. Even it's kind of neck snapping, actually, how, I mostly cover the Trump story because I'm covering the Justice Department. I mean, there's 3 federal indictments of Donald Trump in one state. That is the big story in the Justice Department, and I spend a lot of time going on the air and talking about that. But since the Israel thing has happened, that story has faded a little bit. I mean, it's amazing how fast that happens. And then, if there's a lull in the war in the Middle East, it'll surge back. But really, I mean, particularly when you talk about national media, television networks, there are only a few stories that we concentrate on at one time, a few big stories. And that's true of like the Today Show and Nightly News. It's also true of MSNBC, our cable network, even though we're more oriented to politics. Every hour, like during the day when it's news, I mean, at night is opinion, but during the day when it's news, there are like 4 or 5 stories an hour that we're concentrating on, and then we come back to it. And very few of those stories are foreign news at all, generally, unless there is an enormous global crisis. Aaron asked me when we spoke, do demonstrations help focus the mind and influence? And I saw that David Ignatius said that he didn't think they did at all. But I think that they can't hurt, and I think that for a lot of people, as Charlie said, in our business who have no idea about any of this, if they're wondering why there are people outside our building downstairs, it might cause them to, do some research and learn about it. And I also think that in terms of the Armenian community's influence, relying on prominent supporters within the community who have a voice in Washington. Like, I've been covering Adam Schiff for a long time because of my role as covering the intelligence community, and he was the chairman of the Intelligence Committee for a long time. And I was with the LA Times for a while, so he was like a local congressman for us. So I've known him a long time. I didn't even know until years after I started covering him sort of how involved he is in Armenian affairs because of his district, and I learned he gave a speech in Armenian on the House floor, which was remarkable. So people like that, I think, can play a big role in getting the word out. I feel like we're all sort of apologizing for our industry up here, but I wish I had better news for you. But I'm not sure. I feel like if the displacement of tens of thousands of people didn't get television coverage, because that's a TV story. I mean, my gosh, the emotion, the human tragedy, that's what we do, right? If that couldn't make it, I don't know what will in this situation. But, Carla mentioned the prospect of a further war and an invasion. I mean, that certainly would be an enormous escalation that maybe would start to get some attention. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much. Hopefully we won't need to have that war to get that attention. But also, you're no longer a lapsed Armenian, so don't worry about that. It's on me. After a first career as a Democratic political consultant in Southern California, where he helped many Armenian candidates achieve office, Eric Hacopian moved to Yerevan in 2017. There he has a weekly video show on civilnet.am and cable TV called Insights with Eric Hacopian, which deals with Armenian current issues. And it's amazing, the reach of this show is large. I thought he might have accidentally added a few zeros to the numbers of viewers, but he tells us that there are as many as 80 to 100,000 people on a good week who watch this show, which is translated, starts out in English and is translated into Armenian and Russian versions. And I have to say, he doesn't pull his punches, and he's also well informed to boot. So I think we're looking forward to his talk. Eric.
Thank you all. Thank you, Aram. Thank our wonderful panelists. It's great to be joining you here. As the only person who lives permanently in Armenia, what I'm going to do is try to give more of the local. Is this work?
Yes.
Okay. To give more of a local perspective of someone who doesn't live here and actually lives where all these issues are happening. And I'm sort of going to be jumping from item to item. Some of them might not be directly related, but they're, it's part of a larger salad of things that work together. And let's start off with journalism in Armenia. Journalism in Armenia generally tends to be actually quite poor in quality, to be honest, for the most part. And most of that is driven by, when it comes to issues like this, is a lack of an understanding of the broader world and actually how the journalism world works. And I think this works into some of the things that we've discussed that you were talking about how do you sell a story? If you don't understand how you fit into the world, it's very hard to tell a story that works, especially if you don't have a clear understanding of the outside world. Now, this is changing. When you deal with anything Armenian, anything under 30 is dramatically better than anything over 30. I can just tell you the quality of people, as far as if Armenia was the 26-year-old women, would be Switzerland in like 5 minutes. I can just tell you that. And I think one of the blind spots is, and this is not, frankly, it's not even just Armenian, it's actually regional in that area, that part of the world, is people have a very exaggerated sense of their importance. And this is something that he was talking about, which is you don't understand on some level how insignificant you are, because most people don't want to understand how insignificant you are. And I can tell you in May, I was invited to a conference in Georgia, in Tbilisi, and you land at the airport, and the first thing you see, it says, "This Georgia where Europe started." It's like, really? Not Greece, not Rome. No, it started here, apparently. Now I'm going to move on to perceptions of external coverage from Armenia, or what people see from international coverage, because frankly, a lot of people are well-versed in multiple languages and read, and a lot of the frustrations that all of you, I'm sure many of you have felt about the lack of coverage, people see that. And I think there's an emotional aspect to it, and an uncomfortable one, which I think you need to deal with and we need to talk about is, I was watching one of the French shows on F24, and there was a French actor who said something, of the 100 to 120,000 people that lived in Artsakh, 30,000 of them were children. And he said, what would have happened? What would the coverage have been if there were 30,000 dogs that were blockaded someplace? And if you actually think about it, you don't want to answer that question, because we all know what the answer is. They would have gotten a lot more coverage than what we got. So I think there's a level of anger and hurt, to be honest. And this started with Ukraine, and it's gone on to other places. And obviously, both of you are right. There's tremendous tragedies all over the world, but nobody cares about other tragedies. You care about your own. So I think there's this visceral uncomfortableness. And I have to tell you, as someone who works on media, has worked with media, 80% of our media problems are actually our fault. What I mean is the nation of Armenia and the larger Armenian nation, because you're not telling the proper story. You're not getting people interested in why they should be interested in you. And 20%, but I want to talk about this 20% because it's easy to blame yourself. There is a very particular angst or pushback that you get, especially from what I call Anglo-Saxon media, US, especially British media on some level. And I think for many of these people, we tend to be too dark for the right and too white for the left. There's an element of that. Or because if you're talking about an oppressed person, for the average European, if they know an Armenian, it's a very wealthy jeweler in Belgium. It's the Kardashians. It is not the peasant. It's not the farmer in Artsakh with 7 kids on the top of a hill that makes a subsistence living. The stereotype of the Armenian around the world is not the sympathetic figure. So we get caught up in this where we lose from both sides. I have to tell you, I've worked, and we have a lot of experience on, frankly, what works and what doesn't work. Since December of last year, me and a small group of people worked on trying to generate media for the blockade. And we, for the most part, failed miserably because, frankly, no one cared. No one knew where we were. It was very easy to confuse the issues and do this double-sided thing because it was just, if you don't know about a topic, we were essentially trying to catch up with 30 years worth of work that wasn't done in 9 months. And until the Ocampo report came out, because of his own credibility and his own relationships, that opened up a lot of doors. And what you were mentioning at the end, Charlie, about like that we won the social media narrative, it was quite interesting. Now, I'll go back on this. One of our colleagues actually spoke with the head of Edelman, which is the biggest PR firm in the world, about this. And his response was to this very wealthy person is, are you an idiot? Why are you calling me? And he goes, what do you mean, why am I calling you? He goes, why don't you just get Kim Kardashian? And he goes, are you kidding me? Like, who is she? He goes, you just don't understand how the world works now. And he said, I'll just give you the math. There are 4 billion people on social media in the world today, and 1 out of 4 of them cover her and her sisters on Instagram. So why are you hiring me? She has 105 PR people that work for her on social media. Go to her. And frankly, we did that, through Eric Israeli, and it actually, got the word out and actually had impact because of the coverage that she gets. So it tells you the kind of world, and I think this sort of goes to the social media, because frankly, as you know, there's the traditional media that's dying, and then there's the other media that is very much out of control, weirdly democratic in a way, in the sense that some 15-year-old with a good video can overwhelm the work that you do in 5 minutes, or the work anybody else does for 5 minutes. So you have to think of media in a much more elastic way. I mean, I have people who help me. You put something on Twitter, there's a way that you put it that can have more impact than other things, that have more, you'll get a lot more hits on it, or you get a lot more people forwarding it. One of the things that so all of this time as we're working on PR, you sort of get to see the other side's work. And it was very interesting. And there's 3 things that came out of it. One, they're very good at anything that happens behind closed doors, i.e., there's a former reporter at the BBC or at the Guardian. They can go into a closed door. You give them their $10,000 a month. They can make that pitch. Once you come out of that closed door and they have to stand on their own in any kind of a real media outfit, they frankly fall apart. And they're actually easy to tear apart. And you talk about I've been on forums with them. You talk about their president, they lose their shit because they cannot defend things in the country. If you humiliate them, they shut up. If you tell them that, you had elections in 2013, that the results were, by mistake, released a day earlier than the elections, they shut up, which is what happened. This was the Guardian. On 2013, the day before the election, they announced the results. So once you put them on trial, you put their system on trial, this sort of falls apart as far as what the other side goes. I think at this point, you really have to look in long-term basis. Everything that we're talking about, frankly, is you have to look, when you're talking about media and telling your narrative, it's really a question of a 15 or 20-year process. It's not a 5 or 6 month. 5 or 6 months is an emergency you have to deal with. And there's a lot of really good work that's being done. There's this organization called TAP that's it's like a multi-year project to actually bring people to Armenia, to not write stories simply about emergencies. That's one of the problems with coverage of Armenia now is it's all about negative emergencies. I'll give you some startling things. In Armenia now, there's 4 IT startups that have a valuation of combined $18 billion. Nobody knows about that.
Right.
So I guess you know about it. So I think what you really have to look at is a narrative telling about the place, because what he was too kind to say is, No one gives a shit about you because you're not relevant. So what you have to do is you have to make yourself relevant. And the way you make yourself relevant is talk about things. For example, what we know is that Armenia is pivoting from Russia towards the West. One of the best things with media is, frankly, you don't try to counter their prejudices, you use their prejudices. You, for example, everything that's Armenia related, you put in the context of Russia. You know, Armenia is moving away from Russia, so we're having all these problems. You sort of simplify things, dumb things down, and you don't try to fight their prejudices, you try to write it. And then, if we're being really critical of ourselves, if you really look at it, the entire narrative telling of the Armenian side for the last 108 years is a total failure. Not because we don't have a good story to tell, we actually have a damn good story to tell. One of the things that we've learned is once you get people to come over, once you get people to come or understand the issues, we actually win them over, not because we're geniuses, it's because frankly, we had the better end of the arguments as far as who's the victim and who's the perpetrator. So I think when you look at it, to the average person that knows Armenian, and I can tell you off of polling around the world, only about 1 out of 5 people in the world who are polled, I noticed some tourism polling, wouldn't even know what Armenia is. You know, 1 out of 5. And this tourism polling is actually quite interesting. They had, there's only like 25% of people that would be willing to come to Armenia, which is quite low. But of the people that come to Armenia, when they ask you, will you ever come back, that number is the highest ever recorded in the world. It was 99%. So you have this dichotomy where they don't know you, but if they come over, they'll always come back. But when you look at our narrative telling, you say Armenian, first thing that comes to mind is genocide, okay? Which is fine. You know, you cannot escape that. But how do you tell that story? You know, we have Easter. What day do we celebrate? The resurrection, right? Not the crucifixion. So what do you talk about? You don't talk about the horrible things that we know are there. You talk about how you came back from it and what you've managed to do 108 years later. You know, the children, the grandchildren of genocide survivors are leading the world in IE and chip design now. That's the story that you have to tell. And you take it something like as simple as the Artsakh issue. This was a national liberation struggle that ended up being an occupation story, which is a complete, total narrative fail as far as we're concerned. And lastly, and I know this is going to be controversial, we always like to talk about the first Christian nation. It's true, but no one cares. They don't. The reality of it is that most of the Western world is becoming more and more secular. So if you constantly say that outside of very segmented audiences, what you're really saying is that, you know, I'm not really modern. So I'm not taking sides in this. I'm just telling you it from a public relations perspective. But I think everything at this point is about making the country relevant by highlighting the things that are actually going on in a positive ledger. And both in democratic development, economic development, it's like, you know, it's what I call a dime. It's diplomacy, intelligence, economy, and military. Those are the things that you have to focus on, and those are the narratives you have to tell. Thank you all.
Thank you. That was really good. And I have to say, you as an audience have been really great, too, as far as I could tell. No sounds at all, almost. So thank you for that. And now I think before we open up to Q&A to the audience, I'd like to see if our panelists have anything that they would like to discuss or comment on each of their own, on each other's presentations. Is there, before we open up, is there anything that any of you would like to say? Or, everyone's pretty comfortable saying it there. Okay. Then we can take audience questions, and I'm going to bring the mic over. Raise your hand, right? I raise your hand.
Thank you, guys. I was amazed that none of you mentioned K Street in any of the things you said, as though somehow there's nobody paying for certain type of news to be told and stories to be told, as though we don't exist. And obviously we don't pay through K Street, or we're certainly not paying enough. but somebody is. And they're very effective. They've been able to dominate all the news and tell the story their way. So we are occupying Azeri territory. We are not freedom fighters, but we are some kind of terrorist. I don't even know what kind. And we are not going to be able to not only stay where we were, but having been driven out, we're not even considered refugees or purging or whatever the terminology is. So it's all being told in the opposite way of the way it really is. And the last part I'd like you to comment on is now that the Israeli conflict with Hamas has taken over all the news, and you can't hear any news other than that. Even Ukraine is irrelevant, right? Now that Erdogan has decided that Hamas is not terrorist, but in fact they are protecting their people. And Turkey's job is to protect them as part of the pan-Islamic Turkish movement, whatever he's trying to do. And on top of which, Aliyev is part of this as well. And yet, all the weapons being used against Armenians are Israeli or Turkish. So how do we take that jujitsu and flip it over and make them the villains, make them the anti-Israelis and the Hamas terrorist supporters, and get out of this mess we're in? It's a simple question.
Well, I think the K Street factor is there. But that has a lot more to do on policymakers, frankly, and in shaping the broader narrative than what a reporter or a news organization does on a daily basis. I'm not saying it's not important, but it's not a direct link. As far as the intricacies and the hypocrisies, obviously anything from a political perspective where you combined Aliyev and Erdogan together, talk about two nations, one state, and two states, one nation, and you make Aliyev own all the half-assed crazy things that Erdogan says, 3 times a day. That's a political act, and that's something that starts with politics. It starts with lobbying, and then it bleeds to media. But I think you're shooting in the right direction, but you're hitting the wrong person.
Who should we get?
Can I take a shot at that? Because I'm actually more of an adherent to that theory. I agree entirely with what you said, but K Street is an enormous component here. And for those of you, if you don't know what we're talking about, K Street is the street in downtown D.C. where all the well-heeled lobbyists, all their businesses are, all the firms are there. So we use it as a shorthand in D.C. to talk about the lobbying community. You would say, K Street thinks this. And it is a huge problem that the Armenian community confronts. And this is where, K Street is where members of Congress, when they retire or when they leave or when they just sell out, they go and they hang out a shingle. And by sell out, I don't mean to dismiss too many members of Congress, but there are some who did sell out, who were supporters of, say, the genocide resolution, went to K Street where all the money is coming from the kinds of interests you're talking about, and they conveniently change their position. So that is a very, very real thing. And fortunately, I think there are a couple of advantages that the Armenian community has there, because number one, for a small community, we have some very dynamic voices. We fight like hell, the groups don't get along, all of that, but we have some dynamic voices that do very good work down there. And the other thing, the sort of the special sauce, the superpower that Armenians have is K Street essentially creates an AstroTurf lobby. It's not real. They have lots of money. They throw it around. They buy stories in disreputable media. They can send members of Congress on junkets to Turkey. Like, for example, Gene Schmidt, a little-known Ohio congresswoman who lost a few years ago, who was Turkey's #1 supporter in D.C., to the point where she lost in her primary because she was in Turkey on her primary election day. True story. You can look it up. So, but the difference here is that Armenians have a real grassroots lobby, and members of Congress listen to that. They understand that. You may not think they listen, but they do. When they get lots of calls and people showing up and asking questions, if every member of Congress that has an Armenian community of note, and here by note I mean of size, they know it. And if they don't, you need to let them know. And they respond to that. They understand that those are real votes as opposed to AstroTurf politics that's created by K Street. And so far, Armenians have done fairly well. And I think that is, I don't know for certain, but my vibe is that on Capitol Hill that is understood. And that is why, ultimately, I think, ultimately that's why the genocide resolution was signed. I think all of the things that our community would think of as positive have happened because it has overcome the AstroTurf lobby with a grassroots power.
Getting my exercise here.
Thank you. So I have a question regarding the lack of unity in the Armenian community, not only here in America, but, and Eric, this is pointed to you, the disunity between Hayastansis and the diaspora, and how do we get around this to speak in one voice? I mean, we've seen things resolve in the States after the independence of Armenia, but we still see a divide between what Armenia wants and of the diaspora and what the diaspora wants to give to Armenia. Is it only money? Do we have a unity in purpose and in our political agendas?
I think you have to be very careful when you say unity. Secondly, you have to be very careful when you say diaspora. The Armenian diaspora is 6 to 8 million people, and it could be a cab driver in Buenos Aires. It could be Margarita Simonian and RT. It could be Cher. So you have to be far more exact in what you're talking about. This is not one thing. Secondly, there's no such thing as that unity that we think imaginarily exists everywhere else. Last week there were 300 Jewish Americans that shut down Congress who were against the Israeli side of this fight. So this notion that there's some magical unity anywhere else, it does not exist, and neither should we want it to exist. However, what you want to exist is a clear understanding of what your goals are. And the goals are what I call the 3 nevers, is for Armenia to never to be isolated, poor, or weak. So if anybody is working, if you're here and you're working with people there or you're working with people here towards the goal of not having the 3 nevers, then you're doing your job. But if you're going to wait for some imaginary unity that's never going to happen, that's not how things work. You either do the work, you pick your little corner of the world. If you're in the defense industry, you work with the defense industry there. If you're an ex-special forces guy, you do the same. If you're an educator, you work in education. If you're in journalism, you work in journalism. So let's not have unreasonable standards that can never be met, because I'm not saying this in your case, but more often than not, people come up with excuses not to do the work. And you either are doing the work toward those 3 things or you're not. So that's the standard that everybody should be judged by, not some imaginary unity thing that's never going to happen.
Garapedian is going to be here in Boston. He has been on the circuit in Los Angeles and speaking to universities, and And I don't want to give away what he's going to say, except that it's left a deep impression on me, and he spoke a lot about this issue. And he's careful about what he's saying, but he strongly believes that this is a very unique moment in time, and that it's important to recognize that our goal must be to support the territorial integrity of Armenia, the democracy of Armenia, even if we don't like who's in power, even if we want to blame whomever is in power, and there's going to be an election and they can be voted out. And this idea that somehow we cancel out the politicians and we get rid of them, it's a luxury, he says, that we can't afford to have, because right now, he says, Armenia is facing an existential crisis. You may disagree with that, but if its borders are invaded and a chunk of land is taken away, none of us are going to be happy with that. And so this moment of maybe it's not unity in the sense of everybody agreeing on what to do, but unity in the goal of maintaining Armenia, keeping Armenia Armenian, and recognizing it does have the strength of its democracy in the region. That is a unique characteristic of countries in that region. That is what he calls leverage. Armenia's democracy is leverage. It's the thing that's scaring Russia the most, perhaps, because having a democracy on its doorstep is not good for Russia. So we as a community, how we express this, how we support this, he also says we should go there more and see for ourselves what Armenians are doing. It is exciting to see those under 30s. Those under 30-year-olds, what they're doing, it's so exciting. They've got so much energy and so much forward thinking and so much creative thinking, so much lateral thinking. The youth of Armenia is our future, and we support them by going there. I'm not saying even as tourists, but also in the way that we connect through businesses and our NGOs and our organizations. We make them feel connected to us. So I personally think there's a lot we can do in the diaspora. How united we are, if you want to, I agree, it's a loaded word and maybe not to use that word, but there's a lot on our plate and we can't have a luxury of being bystanders to Armenia falling apart.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. I think a lot about how we as Armenians can get our message out or our stories out. And this is one unusual theme that I'm beginning to see, and that is that the Republicans are beginning to pick up the Armenian cause because they are trying to appeal to the Christian majority. Even if Christianity is not so popular now, it's still the majority of Americans are Christian. There are 100 million Catholics in America. And so they are using this as an opportunity, a political opportunity, and particularly they're talking about 2024, that they're going to try to advertise or promote the idea that the Democrats, the State Department, allowed 100,000 plus Armenians be ethnically cleansed in a part of the world where Christians are disappearing rapidly. I wanted to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think this will become a story, or do you think this is something that will just disappear like so many other things?
I'll take the politics part of it for 500. I think one thing that I've seen, I've seen a little bit of what you're talking about. I think if Republicans embraced it, and if they do, I think it would largely because the composition of the Republican conference is it's highly evangelical, it's deeply faith-driven, and to the extent that they begin to focus on the first Christian nation part, if that works, that's great. I think it's really good. I think it's more important, though, and I think it's probably a promising sign for the community, because I think in recent years, and you would know this much better than me, I mean, I don't think there's been comprehensive studies of how Armenians vote. But my feeling has always been that it was perceived as a largely socially conservative, Republican-oriented group of voters, and that's how politicians look at us all, you know, every ethnic group and how they cast votes. Then it has changed over time, and by Republican you had figures like George Deukmejian and folks like that in various states. I feel like in recent years, and I don't know that I have proof, but the rise of the California Armenians and the California Democratic community and the Armenian community rallying around Adam Schiff and knocking out Jim Rogan in the most Armenian congressional district in country has convinced many Republicans, and because of the sort of metropolitan distribution of Armenians, and what I mean there is like there's not a big concentration in Jackson, Mississippi, you know, of Armenians. All of those factors together, I think, had Republicans thinking that this was a Democratic group. And because of that, why would they want to support things that Democrats like Frank Pallone and Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff are interested in? And so that's probably a long-winded way of saying the more that moves in that direction, the better off, because we need support from both parties, and it is deadly to be perceived as a group that is affiliated with one party, especially in a deeply polarized political environment like that. We just can't be viewed as a one-party ethnic group.
I think he's obviously correct in everything that he said. I'm not going to say too much in detail, but that's part of an organized effort to reach out to that community, and I think it's starting to pay off. The weakest group for Armenian causes in Washington, D.C. have tended to be Republicans for exactly the same reasons that Charlie just outlined. So I think that is changing, and I think there's a natural story to be told, and for many of these people, you know, Armenia is the Christian Israel. And I met many of them who were in Armenia. There were some funny stories which we'll tell off camera, but other than that, but this is not coincidental. It's part of a effort to push people in that direction. And you see it from that Vivek's comments and questions, and he's actually been quite vocal about it.
I would just add that there's another element that sort of touches on the Christianity issue, which is the cultural destruction, the cultural genocide that has resonated in media, the pictures of the monasteries in the Vanks. So you'll see on Sky News in particular has a reporter who has covered Artsakh and what's been going on there, and she will go to the monasteries and interview Armenians and say, what do you feel about what's going to happen to this place? And that was before everybody moved out, of course, but it's very visual to see these places. It resonates, and it's also a theme which I think we need to keep on about this in terms of getting support in the international community. What's going to happen to some of these places? What do we do to stop their destruction? What sort of SOS do we put out to the UNESCOs of this world and other organizations that try to protect cultural heritage? Just because there aren't Armenians in Artsakh doesn't mean we can't still be advocating for those properties and those places and the people who are still there, trying to protect them. So that is a Christianity issue, but of a different kind.
What are the chances of the West and Brussels and the State Department putting enough pressure on Aliyev and Erdogan to allow Armenians from Artsakh to return to their homes? Because today I was reading on Armen Chibukchan's blog. He's a blogger from California who talks a lot about Armenia. And he was talking about Aliyev, one of his foreign ministers, making a statement saying that if the Armenians don't return, then they're going to allow the Azeris to occupy the homes of the Artsakh Armenians.
As distressing as this may be to hear, I think the chances of that are very low. I mean, from what I can tell from talking to people who are covering this issue at the State Department, Blinken did get involved a little bit, but it just doesn't seem like the U.S. feels like they have a dog in this fight in terms of the kind of resources and diplomatic pressure it would take to make that happen, and sanctions, particularly with everything else that's going on in the world.
Let me be very clear. The United States State Department is not our friend. It has never been our friend. And I can tell you they knew it exactly in advance what was going to happen, and they didn't give a shit. And in fact, many of them see it as a solution. So whatever they say, they're not being truthful. I can just tell you that point blank.
Well, I will be the only Armenian today who will speak with accent. Everybody's looking. So anyway, well, thank you for this presentation. It's very useful in this time especially. And first about Christianity, well, I'm priest. So I have but say comment that when 100 genocide 100th anniversary happened, what made it noise most people international was the Pope's acknowledgement of the genocide. So still religion can have a big role, you know. Of course, in different, if we are smart. And I think in this regard, we are working well with Vatican and with the other international religious organizations. Now, one question to Charles. So by the way, I follow you every day almost, Eric, and I listen a lot. I mean, your interviews, you know, your program. But I listen also, there are a lot of Armenian things in Armenia, and I spend some hours every day. And there were some very strange ideas about that article in Politico about Blinken meeting with the Pelosi, you know. So one saying that was just specially leaked information to put pressure on Azerbaijan. The other expert, those who are Armenian-speaking expert in Armenia, the others say that was U.S. saying that we are not going to intervene if something happens. So what do you think, what was the point of that article which made big noise? Maybe Eric, you will know, or Charles, you know. I know. Thank you.
I thought sooner or later, sorry, you want to take it?
Yeah, one thing I think it's important to say that Ken reminded me of during your remarks, and I've been foolish not to say it. I speak for myself. I do not speak for my news organization, and that's a really important distinction to make. These are only my own personal opinions. Second point of the story. I was not involved in that story at all, so I can't speak with any familiarity. I don't mean to give you bureaucratic speak there. I literally don't know, and I shouldn't speak. I mean, oftentimes media organizations are very rigidly segmented in many ways, and I have no familiarity with the reporting. Who were the reporters on that?
It was the guy from Armenia.
Right.
Yeah, Gabriel, and another person with an Italian or Latino name.
Eric?
Yeah.
All I will say is this. I was not involved in it. I don't know anything about it. I know that those two are... Gabriel, I know very well, work with closely on other projects. They are well-sourced and they are committed reporters.
First of all, be careful of expert opinion from Armenia, because the most dangerous word in Armenian is masnaged, which is expert. Because as soon as someone tells you they're an expert, it usually means they don't know shit. You know? So that's a given. The other thing is, I think that story, and when it comes to the State Department, you can only believe it if it's been officially denied. So it's been officially denied, so it's true. But I think there's nuance to that. There was a period in the first couple of days right after the ethnic cleansing where there was tension of war and a possibility of an invasion. That was real. That was a 72-hour period in which it was a weekend, actually. I remember, we were all expecting it. All the indications were there, and it did not happen. I think, to be fair to Blinken, he might have been referring to that rather than an ongoing thing. So do I believe anything the State Department says? No, but there's also context, and you have to understand what he could have said when. The answer, your question is the ultimate question, and the ultimate answer is it could be absolutely not, or things can change on a dime. I can tell you part of this is driven by the fact that this timeline is closing. Now that Armenia especially can buy arms from the West, with all the NATO the bans have been lifted. Armenia has significant weapons orders coming from Western countries. So I think it's tempting to do things now that you won't be able to do 6 months from now. So there's some tactical things involved. But then from a practical point of view, he just got away with genocide without any consequences. Attacking a sovereign territory of another state is a much more problematic politically. It doesn't mean it won't happen. It's just much more problematic politically.
I'm sorry for the whispering. I just have to leave, and I so regret it. This has been a wonderful evening with so many smart people and such great questions. I'm really sorry. I have to fly back home. I flew in this afternoon because I thought it was such an important issue. I'm flying back tonight. Thank you. And the only reason I do it is because it's for an event for my daughter. I have to be there, and I have to be home tonight, and we have to get out at 7 in the morning tomorrow. So I'm flying back, and I'm so sorry to leave right now.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate this, Charles Mahtesian. And we'll take one or two more questions, and then I think we're going to open up the refreshments.
I have a question about the American media, and maybe it's naive of me, but when I was looking for information about Armenia in the past 6 weeks, I was looking at RT and the BBC and even Al Jazeera and other news sources because I couldn't find news sources coming from the United States. And so when we talk about there not being coverage, why is the United States different? Why is there coverage from news organizations in other parts of the world? And then my follow-up to that is I was also looking at CivilNet quite a bit. And are there opportunities for partnerships between the U.S. media and CivilNet or some of these wonderful under 25 or under 30 people in Hayastan who might be able to do reporting?
One thing I would say is that when I was looking for coverage and to prepare for this, I found a lot of really interesting stuff in the New York Times. I don't know how you guys feel about how they've covered this, maybe a little too both sidesism, but I feel like I learned a lot from their coverage. There was spot news, there was analysis, there was stuff from the region, stuff from Europe, diplomatic coverage. But in general, I mean, I don't know if you guys agree that like the BBC is always going to be more interested in foreign news than any American news outlet, even the New York Times, and that's just the reality of our country and our vast geographic spaces, and we're focused inward and more so than most other places.
It is partly about resources, but it's also what is our government talking about. The foreign policy, the stories that are foreign policy related are often influenced by what our politicians or our leaders are saying about those stories. So if you flip that to the other side and they're not talking about something, then you're not going to get the amount of coverage unless it's coming from the ground up. And the Armenia story isn't coming from the ground up unless we Armenians all over America rise up one day and, have a mass demonstration of some sort. And we did do that in 2015. And guess what? The world noticed. The pictures of Armenians commemorating the genocide were, all over the world and say, hey, who are these people? So, I mean, we are capable of doing that. But in this case, the Biden administration doesn't really want to talk about this for lots of reasons, which we've hinted at here and talked about. So if they're not talking about it, and you don't have opposition people talking about it, so you're not hearing it from the other side, then where is it being generated? So that's part of it. And that applies to a lot of foreign policy issues, not just the Armenian issue.
This is not really a civil net issue because news organizations don't cooperate with each other generally. So that's there's yes, but yes and no. What we have is systems in place to work reporters who come to Armenia. And we found some very specific things. What we did is when someone calls you, especially from a US or British outlet, you limit it to 2 or 3 people who speak, I hate to say it, perfect American English. Because if they put up, some guy with an Azeri name from some made-up think tank, and there's a woman that sounds like Carla, Carla wins before saying anything. So part of it is we have a system of working reporters who come there, and they all get the treatment about the 5 or 10 people that can spin the story the right way. You have to. I mean, one of the things he talked about, I think maybe Charlie talked about, how politicians have relationships with reporters. As a consultant, I always had relationships. You do them favors, they do you favors. You kill things, they kill things. So it's media is relationships, and part of it is narrative telling, and to build these is to be able to tell your story, and to actually limit who tells your story. It's just as important who they don't talk to than who they talk to.
Well, I hope the Mirror-Spectator can be friends with CivilNet. We like it. Maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll see one there and one here. You're closer, so.
Hi. What's your advice to the next generation? I mean, do we need more public relations, kids going to go into public relations or journalism or both? And Eric, would love to hear a little bit more about your public relations efforts, if possible.
No, I think it's what I call the long march to the institutions. It's an old phrase from the 60s. I grew up in an immigrant family, and no one encouraged me to go into politics. I can tell you that much. They thought I was just an idiot, the extended family, not my immediate family. Or they thought I was strange, So you want to encourage kids to go in all directions. Listen, media at this point is, political is, the reason it's successful is because it's online and has no fixed costs. They don't broadcast anything. So I think is to not limit your kids to become doctors and lawyers. To get into things that are interesting. I'm just overwhelmed by the power of social media and how it works. I'll give you a perfect example, and I knew how brilliant the stuff, the Ukrainian war effort, there's like 105 firms that work on it. And I'll never forget, one day, it was the first 10 days of the war, and there was this idiotic story about how a Ukrainian cat was pointing out Russian snipers and for the Ukrainian snipers to kill. Now, anyone who has ever dealt with cats knows that if it's a war zone, cats will be running 10,000 miles away. Dogs, yes, they'll be there like idiots, but cats, no. Then you figure out that everyone who owns a cat understands this is utter stupidity. However, what do they know? In every block, in every Western country, there's a cat lady with 15 cats who hates men, okay? And that person will retweet that. This story had 1.2 million retweets, even though they all know it's absolute nonsense. So this is someone who can create that is as relevant, I'm sorry to say, as reporters.
Got to work on the dog constituency.
Thank you. We've been talking about media coverage and then the importance of it, obviously, and one benefit to us as Armenians is the certain comfort of having everybody else know what we're going through. But ultimately, perhaps the goal is to impact policy. As Eric, you said, State Department is no friend. Are there some strategies or certain kinds of coverages that might impact policy more than others? And is there some way to perhaps focus our efforts in those ways, if that makes sense?
Piggybacking on the point that you made earlier about framing it in terms of Russia. I mean, things that are bad for Russia are popular in Washington right now. So if that's that's one way to sell a policy that you might be wanting to put forward in D.C.
I can tell you a perfect example of that is there's this corridor that they keep talking about, right? So every time a Western reporter comes, I don't call it, I call it the Putin corridor. Because he wants to stay there, he wants to stay in Armenia, and this is the way to do it. So just the simple change just kills it. You call it the Putin corridor, well, that can't be a good thing. So it's the words we speak is the house we live in. So the smallest things that you can say can impact how a story goes.
I thank you for tonight. About 2 weeks ago, I was actually in Hayastan and Armenia, and I was at the IT center in Gyumri. And while I was there, I said, our youth are the hope of the Armenians, because it's a phenomenal, the IT centers. I'd like your opinion on this. My belief is that just as Hitler watched the indifference of the world to the Armenian genocide and went ahead with the Holocaust and Khmer Rouge and Rwanda and Sudan, Putin watched the world's indifference to Armenia and what happened in the Artsakh war. And I think that's why he went into Ukraine. Do you agree with this? And then the other thing, and I know what's going to be said, we all know Israel's role in helping the Azeris. And then when they saw the blockade, now they're doing it to Hamas. The world does not cover that. Maybe they should.
Your first line, it doesn't even matter if it's true. It's actually very usable. So whether it's true or not, it's completely irrelevant, but that's what should be told to every reporter. So thank you very much. On the second one, obviously there's some parallels there, but it's also, there's some differences there. And the way power relations are and the media coverage is, that's not really, that's not a contrast that's going to help us.
Last question, and I think we're going to go, all right, 2 questions, and then we'll go to the break. Food.
Thank you all. My question is, so I'm in the young generation, and I'm also concerned about my child's generation. Because we're in part of the diaspora, and also Armenia's on the other side of the world, I've been involved with the community, and a lot of my friends, they kind of, I think there's lack of communication or knowing the truth between the diaspora and Armenians and Armenians of Artsakh. Not everyone has had an opportunity to meet people from Artsakh too and connect with them, but things are changing. And I wanted to know what are your advice in terms of how especially our generation, everybody here, can work on communicating more with the current people of Artsakh that have been displaced, as well as Armenians, so that we can share the story, what's actually going on to the world together. Wanted to ask that.
Well, I think the idea of going there, as simple as that sounds, is worth doing. I know a young man who was 16 years old, half Armenian, and didn't really feel connected to his roots. Kind of curious, but wasn't too sure. His family had to push him to go to Armenia. It was with the Paros Foundation, where they did some volunteer work, and he ended up becoming a complete convert to going to Armenia, and this he didn't meet a girl, no, but he did break up with the non-Armenian girlfriend, okay, and then he went back the following year, and it wasn't in Yerevan. It started in Yerevan. It was in Gyumri. So he's now, he was raising money for the various projects in Gyumri. So the point is, it wasn't just about going to the place. It was connecting to other young people his age. And also they could drink there underage, like he was 18, so he was, excited about that. So maybe there were some other things going on there. But the point is, there's that. Kids going and connecting. The other thing, it's not the same thing, but and I think there is a kind of youth culture that has to do with arts and music and the groups. No, I mean like the bands and the music. It crosses over from here to there. So if you're interested in Armenian musicians and things, here it has a way. It's an international community, and it's a way we communicate with each other through music and the arts. And I think Armenia is becoming better through Creative Armenia, which I'm on the board of, and I can see what they're doing. They're both fostering the talent there, but they're getting them to us here to help them there, and the crossover, the bridges, all that's great. And it speaks to the young people to where they are, the things that they care about.
I'll say one thing. I'll piggyback on what she said. There's a big difference between almost all the news that comes out of Armenia is negative, okay? But the reality isn't that. Now, it doesn't mean that the negatives are not true. It doesn't mean that the threats aren't true. But there's also a hell of a lot of positive things that go on. I mean, if 5 years ago, people would have told you that there are people that move to Armenia to get jobs, all the Russians and Indians are doing all the delivery work in Armenia now, okay? Armenia has like the highest per capita wage in the entire region, more so than Russia at this point, and Turkey, and Iran. So people don't know these things, so all you see is the negatives. Now, it doesn't mean that the negatives aren't true, but there's the positive side of the ledger. But I will always say this, if you have your little corner of the world, be active in that little corner of the world. Don't listen to the naysayers and do things, whatever it is. That old story about, the sky is falling and the bird comes down and sits and puts his feet up. It's like you take your little corner, and if it's media education, I'd love someone like you to come to lecture to reporters in Armenia, So it would be, it's like that's your corner of the world. And I don't know what your specialization is, but you can, it's the key thing is to do something. I am so sick and tired of people. If you see the social media stuff that I get, the vitriol and the hatred, and the worst of it comes from the United States. The worst of it comes from Southern California. And it's just absolutely asininely stupid. And it's like, okay, move your ass and go there and do something. Or be part of it, rather than sit here with unreasonable expectations. And so you're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. It's as simple as that.
I would just add, that is so true. And it's part of helping them to build their civil society. By us linking our civil society with their civil society, we strengthen their civil society. So, there's a judge in Southern California in Orange County. Her name is Ghasia Abkarian. You may have heard of her. And she got so fed up with what she's hearing about the atrocities going on in Artsakh, she decided, I'm going to train lawyers how to interview people who've experienced atrocities and whatever, so that we can have a record, a legal record of what's happened to some of the people who've experienced human rights abuses in Artsakh. Why is that important? Because one day, if you ever want to go to an international court of law, you need to have a very consistent way of questioning people that will be credible, so the rules of evidence and all of that. So she's trained about, 30 or 50 lawyers, and they're now going to Armenia and interviewing people. And that's an example of somebody who says, I got to do something. And that's what she decided to do, and it has a practical, consequence.
Thank you. I'm only going up one more time because I'm getting tired, and then maybe one at this end, and then that's it. So.
Mr. Eric. So I liked how you said that 80% of the problem is from us, because when we have discussions like with Armenians and when we read Armenian news, we always like to point fingers at, oh, look at what Azerbaijan and Turkey is doing. I mean, they have their own agenda, and I know it sucks, but good for them. But what are we doing about it? And why don't we ever have a discussion about, like, we made mistakes. What are the mistakes that we made? How did we get to our current situation today? And a lot of times we don't talk about these things. We just like to point fingers at everyone. And when we like to blame everyone but ourselves, then we have a serious problem. So my question about that is, how can we change the narrative, or at least the perspective, and make it more proactive? Because some of the questions, there's far more pressing issues that just go over people's head. I get it, like, we talk about what can America do, why isn't the media covering it? To be honest, we're just not a big player in the region, and that's just a harsh reality. But there are certain things that we could do. Like, for example, people are talking that 100,000 Armenians from Artsakh are now in Armenia. It's like, I just read a report that 10,000 have already currently left for abroad. These are serious issues, but no one is talking about it. And another issue that we could address is like, okay, it's unfortunate what happened, but the Artsakh leaders, they gave up fighting within one day, and they surrendered more than $1 billion in arms. And like, what actions are being done to like hold accountability and to prevent like future mistakes like this? Thank you.
It's a lot of questions.
That was last one, please.
Well, it's a lot of questions in one, but I'll focus on the most important one, which is taking responsibility is not something nobody likes to do. As you know, victory has 1,000 fathers and defeat is an orphan. There's a lot of I think what I ask people is that you literally take into it's like, what did you do? I moved into Armenia in 2017. Maybe I could have moved in 2007. I don't know that. So I think the instinct to not blame others is a very good one, because ultimately at the end of the day you make your own bed. And everything bad that's happened to us, it comes from 30 years of lack of state building. Okay? You're either building a proper state, a proper democracy, a proper military, a proper state, or this is the fate that you're going to get. It's as simple as that. So, and the fact that it took 30 years talks about the incompetence of the other side. It doesn't talk about our brilliance. So you just have to question yourself, and you have to focus on things. This is of interest to you. I can tell you, the Soviet Union in Armenia really ended last year. It ended with the September invasions of Armenia, in which people figured out, no, the important decisions are not made somewhere else. Good or bad, they're made by you here. They might be made by idiots, they might be made by smart people or mediocre people, but you control your own fate. So I think the instinct of your question is the correct one. And it's also a very Oriental thing, where everything is someone else's fault. There's some English plot, Soros and, Charlie Chaplin and like Mickey Mouse got together and came up with a plot. That's not how the world works. You either get your shit together or you don't.
And the thing about a democracy is, for it to survive, you have to have term limits on the leaders. We have that now. You have to have a strong media that checks and balances on the power. You have to have a judiciary that isn't corrupt. And that you can see, okay, it hasn't been around that long in Armenia, but at least there's some transparency there. So that's where, when you say if we support democracy in Armenia, that's what that means in practice. Building civil society, Ken going over and, giving hope to the journalists there, or, speaking to them, having a dialogue, you know what I mean? That's part of building civil society. So what you're asking for is, what should happen is the people who are responsible for those errors are voted out, and that they are held accountable. That's the way it should work. And we haven't had that in Armenia until there was a real democracy through a Velvet Revolution. And there are mistakes, and people are blaming and thinking, okay, what should have been done differently? And that's right to ask that. But just remember, if the democracy works, those leaders will be voted out. And there's the chance for somebody else to come in their stead. There's transparency and accountability through the government. That hasn't been around that long in Armenia. So that's the fact, exactly what was just said, that it hasn't been that long that the Soviet Union and its influence left.
Okay, the very, very last question. I better be a short one. Good luck.
Thank you, Arm. I think it was Ken that said that the reason this hasn't really been a breakthrough story is because the sponsors don't really perceive it. I think it was you. Don't really perceive it as a story that has staying power or really has that much interest. But where are we this moment? We are at a situation where this is kind of buried. If it is ever covered, it's buried like in the 10th paragraph. The fact that the leader of Azerbaijan has named one of the main streets of Stepanakert, has renamed the street Enver Pasha, as if the equivalent would be if you renamed a street in Tel Aviv Adolf Hitler Boulevard. This is not picked up. This is a big story. The fact that the Azeri artillery and weaponry is arrayed all across the eastern border. The fact that there have been joint exercises in Nakhchivan, and there's a lot of movement in the direction of we're about to be attacked, and they, despite what they might say, I mean, they say one thing, they sign agreements, but then those are in the past, they change their mind. But you have to watch what they're signaling. And so here we are, and the media tends to be reactive. So if there's an invasion, maybe you'll cover it. But what about what they're signaling now so that you cover it before there's an invasion, so that you influence the policymakers, so that if they're going to do anything other than France, they may actually be influenced by what you're covering and analyzing. And that is not really, that's not a story that I'm sensing is being told.
No, yeah. I think it's a fair point, and I think we should be covering it. We should be asking, for example, U.S. intelligence agencies what they are seeing. Do they anticipate an invasion? Because I think if it comes to the point where an invasion is imminent, that's when you will see the U.S. government get involved to try to stop it in some way. Because and as you were saying, Eric, that's a line that it's a different kind of line to cross in geopolitics, and that would really, I think, elicit a much different world response.
I think I don't have much to add to. I mean, you're absolutely correct, but it's the same chicken and the egg. Convince them of something in a part of the world that they have little interest in to prevent an invasion. Well, they're not policymakers. So it's a hard juxtaposition. But however, how you can overcome that over time is if you're actually telling the correct story and making the country more relevant, to the world. I can tell you a perfect example. There's a big effort worldwide to bring in-source chip design and chip production from China and Taiwan. There's the 3 top chip design companies in the world. 2 of them work in Armenia, and that's what they do. In fact, I don't know if you guys know Yervan Zoryan. He's the head of Synopsys. I had heard a story that he's actually trying to bring EU chip design work, part of the money, into Armenia. And he said, no, you got it all wrong. The EU is trying to copy our system where we're actually, the universities are producing people that we can essentially walk into a job to do chip design, because chip design is much different than regular coding. It's much more sophisticated. So here you have the European Union asking Armenian companies to help them teach Europeans how to do something. You take TUMO centers, Angela Merkel's last act as chancellor was to open the TUMO Center in Berlin. There's one opening up in the United States. In California, an Armenian nonprofit is starting a school to teach kids how to code for free. That's paid for by the state of California. So I think when you do that, then you could have those kinds of expectations. But before that, unfortunately, no.
Thank you very, very much. I think we had a wonderful evening with great speakers. I'm very happy on behalf of the Armenian Mirror-Spectator to thank them for their participation and our sponsor, the Armenian Democratic Liberal Party. And I hope many of you will see you tomorrow. As I said, we have a few more tickets for the banquet, so I can't not say it. If you are interested, come talk to me. But otherwise, I hope you'll stay in touch and enjoy the food that we have and coffee and some drinks. And you can. Thank you for coming.